Hello, let's start. You're all very, very welcome to the fourth session of this semester's ENLIGHT lecture series, exploring the role art and performance can play in the fight against climate change. We will also give examples on how creative changes of the narrative on climate change can help to raise awareness of the severeness of the issue and its impact on human existence. Other than in previous lectures, we have 5 speakers today, so we have to be extra cautious on timekeeping and to make sure that we have at least a little bit of time for questions at the end. I will keep the introductions short, and I will introduce all speakers now ahead of the presentation so that we can go through quicker. To our audience today, if you have a question, please submit them through the chat function and add the name of the speaker you would like to respond to it. We will not have a lot of time at the end, but we also have another networking platform where we will move, and Alexandra will link it in the chat. So you can also, if you didn't have the opportunity to have your questions answered here, you can bring it over to the networking event. My name is Tina Karen Pusse. I'm a lecturer at NUI Galway. I'm one of the speakers today, but my turn will be later. So our first speaker today is Frida Buhre. She is an affiliated researcher at the Department of Literature at Uppsala University. She's an expert on contemporary rhetoric around climate change, and she examines COP26 as performance. Her research explores how contemporary rhetoric of climate change uses imaginaries of time. In her current book project, Frida argues for the importance of anachronisms in political rhetoric. Then the second speaker will be Marco Carcciolo. He's an associated professor of English and literary theory from Ghent University. He recently started to investigate the relationship between narrative and scientific models to talk about the issue of narrating climate uncertainty. And he coordinates the ERC starting grant project, Narrating the Mesh, with a nice acronym NARMESH. Marco's work focuses on the phenomenology of narrative or the structure of the experiences afforded by literary fiction and other narrative media. Then follows the talk of Stef Craps, our third speaker. He is also a professor of English literature at Ghent University, and he discusses the question how to mourn a glacier. He has widely published on memory and trauma studies, post-colonialism and ecocriticism, especially ecological grief, climate change fiction, and transcultural Holocaust memory. After him, it will be my turn. As I said, I'm a lecturer at NUI Galway in the area of German and contemporary global literature, and I will be raising the question, Ecologies of Scale, how to address the limits of human perception. In the area of ecocriticism, I've published on the anthropocentrism-ecocentrism divide, on representations of the biological uncanny, and on right-wing cultures of apocalypse preparedness. Our final speaker for today then will be Christel Stalpaert, and her talk is called Art Activating Climate Change Awareness. She's a lecturer of theater studies also at Ghent University. It's a big crowd of Ghent today. She's widely published in theater and performance studies with a focus on corporeality, performativity, and intermediality at the intersection point of philosophy and ethics. She is a co-director of the research group SPAM, Studies in Performing Arts and Media, and an active member of the international research group Choreography and Corporeality, International Federation of Theatre Research. So that was a quick run through all the participants today. I'm now handing over directly to our first speaker, Frida Buhre.
Thank you, Tina Karen, for that introduction, and also thank you to ENLIGHT for this kind invitation to let me participate in this exciting panel. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. So most of my research these days is concerned with the political aesthetics of youth who are engaged in climate actions of different kinds. And today I wanted to zoom in on COP, which is the United Nations Climate Conference taking place every year. And most people perhaps think of COP as a international negotiation between different parties, different countries, setting the frameworks for global climate politics. But it is so much more than that. It is also a site that some of my colleagues have shown this, that it's a site that brings together different actors with different interests and creates a sense of coherence, or a site where these different actors meet. And as I suggest in this lecture, it is also a site with different aesthetic forms. And I wanted to talk today about the different forms of political aesthetics among the youth at COP and the differences in their performative roles. Okay, so what do I mean then by political aesthetics? And I'm borrowing this concept from, it's like a bit of a mishmash between different theoretical influences, but Jacques Rancière and Judith Butler perhaps are the most immediate theorists that I draw from. So political aesthetics means, in a very basic sense, it's the scripts and repertoires of politics. So the way that we sound, the way that we move, the way that we interact and look in politics. So one can think of politics then as a stage where different types of performances take place, where different types of enactments of these scripts take place in order to create a particular political subjectivity. So what then does subjectivity means? I mean it here in a very basic sense. It's the way that we present ourselves in public, the way that an audience sees and understands a speaker. So it's a public persona, an ethos. And of course, if we have this aesthetic understanding of politics, there's also a radical potential that some actors will refuse or resist to perform within the established scripts and attempt to reformulate them. So then that brings me to the question of youth. Children and youth make up 1/3 of the world's population. They have also been recognized within the UN system as one of the major groups with special interests, and as a group that has a right to have a voice and to share their perspectives on political topics that concern them. That also means that they have a particular place or a particular position from which to speak in the COP. They have the opportunity to assume a public persona with certain forms of aesthetics. So I went to COP26 in Glasgow, and I conducted interviews with young people who were there. I observed them, and I've also done document analysis of the UNFCCC system and the way they talk about youth. But I wanted to talk today about different positions that youth take, or different forms of subjectivity. And these four are the ones I'll talk briefly about. So the competent negotiators, youth who participate in the COP, assume this role very clearly. Not all of them, but it's the youth representatives of the national delegations, and YOUNGO, which is the youth NGO, so the youth constituency at the UNF, or at the COP, sorry. So these are young people that present themselves as competent, and they have a very sort of deliberative, diplomatic strategy. And of course, we can ask, is this a radical potential that they present themselves as negotiators? I would say yes, because we are not used to seeing young people perform in this way. It also challenges hegemonic understandings of young people as less politically competent, less politically responsible than adults. We also see a lot of young people assuming the role of innovative solution finders. They here often assume positions of like the leaders of the future, or young people as particularly creative or innovative. Of course, this taps more into the more established scripts and repertoires of these sites. Another category is children as rights holders. Children and youth as a particularly vulnerable group with therefore particular rights. And you see here images from UNICEF and Save the Children. So for example, questions of climate education as a particular field where children have the right to access that. Of course, here the strategies are somewhat different. It's emphasizing the vulnerability of children and their difference to adults, but also there's a sort of rhetorical dimension of holding grown-ups to account. I would say that the radical potential here is not as clear because it's such a clear position from which young people have spoken up previously in politics. And then, of course, you have the activists who are also there, and they are coming from a wide range of different organizations, where Fridays for Future is perhaps the most prominent one. They have, of course, a more radical aesthetics. They are confrontational. They do loud protests. They focus on questions of justice, and that they are the underdogs. They are the true representatives of democracy and the marginalized. Of course, this position has been given before as well, but it has become more prominent, and it has also been occupied by youth voices. So in that way, it is a transformation of the field. Oops, sorry. I did not intend to play that one, but they're chanting in the conference site. So to conclude, youth and their participation is governed by practical limitations and barriers of various kinds, like costs and a code of conduct and getting the badges. But their conduct is also governed by norms and aesthetic traditions. And I would say that the youth who participate in these sites are torn between professionalized performances and more revolutionary aesthetics. And I'll close there, and I will leave the word to Tina Karen. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Frida. And as I said, I immediately hand over to Marco.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Let me know if not. I'm very pleased to be here. Thanks, everyone. Special thanks to Stef, who will talk after me, for involving me in this ENLIGHT network. Okay, so I'll start by sharing my screen. I hope you can see it. As Tina said at the beginning, what I will present today is a work in progress that I developed as part of the NARMESH project, which is funded by the European Research Council and is based here at Ghent University. Okay, so the central concept is uncertainty. The point of departure being that the climate crisis confronts us with many question marks that have to do with the inherent physical complexity of climate change. So there are so many different factors at play that scientists find it very difficult to model and predict the future. So typically we are confronted with a multiplicity of more or less catastrophic scenarios, but we really don't know what the world will look like in, for example, 2025 or 2050, and so on and so forth, right? So there is this fragmentation, this temporal fragmentation of the future, which reflects just how complicated the system that we call the Earth is. But also there is an extra layer of complication, if you want, that has to do with the unpredictability of political responses to climate change. So in a sense, we have the political uncertainty that surrounds the climate change debate that compounds the inherent complexity of the Earth system. And these two systems, when they interact, create, I think, unprecedented uncertainty. So what's interesting about this uncertainty is that, well, first of all, there is a very clear link between this experience of the future as unreadable and certain manifestations of what we could call climate change anxiety. So those of us who are listening to climate scientists, and of course that's not everyone, might feel particularly anxious about the future precisely because it is difficult to imagine concretely the future. And this kind of uncertainty also comes up quite a lot in the discourse of climate change denialism, in that climate change skeptics have been very strategic in pointing to the uncertainty that is part and parcel of scientific models, and using that uncertainty in a very misguided way, obviously, to undermine the science itself, right? So there are many dimensions to this idea of climate uncertainty. What I'm interested in more specifically is how contemporary fiction, contemporary literature, but especially of the fictional kind, of the narrative kind, can respond to this uncertainty. So how the uncertainty is represented, but also perhaps I think more interestingly, how this uncertainty is addressed or maybe even resolved by certain cultural texts that we call literature. An important concept here is the concept of narrative negotiation, which has been developed by two colleagues here in Belgium, Luc Herman and Bart Verwaak, who write about narrative as a practice that is particularly good at bringing up certain cultural topics and doing something with them. And you know, there's a whole variety of things that narrative can do with a certain topic that is negotiated. And as I said, it goes from mere representation of a certain cultural issue to a deeper kind of imaginative negotiation. So what I try to do in this project, which is actually based on a book that is coming out later this year, I'll mention it at the end again. What I try to do is I try to chart the scale of negotiation, let's say, the many ways and multiple ways in which narrative can engage with uncertainty and do something productive with it. The basic level, as I said before, is the level of representation. So in so many instances of contemporary literature that deals with environmental topics, we encounter characters who experience in a first-hand way the psychological consequences of this uncertainty that I talk about. So this is literature that directly represents uncertainty and its psychological impact, for example, in the form of climate anxiety. A very good example of that is this novella by Lauren Groth that you can see here on the slide. But that is a basic level, right? The level of representation is where things start, but then of course, I think it gets more interesting the more we go along this spectrum of narrative negotiation, if you want. Level 2 is has to do not with the content, with the representational subject matter of narrative, but with the form, right? And as a literary scholar, of course, I'm very drawn to formal questions, and I think narrative can capture what it's like to be uncertain, what it's like to feel this kind of climate uncertainty in a formal way. So just a quick illustration of this phenomenon. I want to point to a novella by Jesse Kellerman called Controller, which deploys a narrative strategy, a formal strategy that I call parallel story worlds. So essentially, this text is built on a juxtaposition of scenarios that detail what would happen to the same set of characters at different degrees of warming. So we have the same day in January, you can see it here on the slide, exactly the same day, the same protagonists, a mother and her grown-up son, who are in a very conflictual relationship. These parallel scenarios suggest what would happen to their relationship, reflecting something as simple but also as important as the weather, right? So patterns in the weather and how they can influence, in this case, psychological conflict in a very mundane situation. So I think this juxtaposition is a formal device that encapsulates the fragmentation of the future. How when we think about climate change, we have to think about multiple scenarios, right, that are very clearly and formally portrayed by the narrative through this device. We also have, of course, narrative that can elicit uncertainty directly in the reader. And that is also, I think, a very interesting possibility. Of course, any story builds on a baseline level of uncertainty. If you think about suspense, we don't know how a story will end, and therefore there is a certain uncertainty at play in our experience of the narrative. But of course, contemporary fiction that deals with the climate can do something much more interesting with uncertainty and really put the reader in a very uncomfortable position of experiencing in a first-hand way the uncertainty of the future. So that is a more radical possibility that I think resonates with this book by Porter Abbott called Real Mysteries, that explores areas of interpretive resistance in narrative and the kind of profound uncertainty they create in the reader. So that is level 3 of the spectrum of negotiation. And then there is a fourth level, which has to do certainly with the reader's experience, but also with the psychological impact of exposure to certain narratives. And I want to make clear here that I'm not talking about the immediate effect of reading a single story. This is more about protracted exposure to narratives that do something interesting with uncertainty. But what I call embrace of uncertainty is a certain kind of impact the narrative can have on readers, and that fundamentally consists in a more nuanced appreciation of uncertainty. So to put the same point otherwise, when we think about uncertainty, normally we think about something that is undesirable, that has to be reduced or even eliminated at all costs. So that is the kind of standard conventional negative stance on uncertainty. What I call embracing uncertainty is a form of acceptance of uncertainty as something that pervades our everyday life, including our experience of the climate future. And I'm interested in how reading literary texts can foster this kind of more positive, or at least more sophisticated appreciation of uncertainty as something that is certainly undesirable in some situations, but can also be a source of creativity and productivity. So the big question that, of course, I cannot answer here is what kind of strategies do we need to cultivate this form of response to literature? What do we need to train readers who are able to embrace uncertainty in this more complex way that I talk about? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's an interesting question and is one that certainly calls for interdisciplinary collaboration with, for example, psychologists and scholars of education, right? So this was a very, very brief overview of my take on uncertainty, but if you're interested, I have a book coming out in April. It's actually an open access book, so you can just go online and download it and put it in a folder and forget that it exists if you want, but here's the link. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. I am done.
Thank you very much, Marco. And thanks to both Frida and Marco for excellent timekeeping. So it's now over to Stef.
Okay, thank you. And hello, everyone. Let me just start by sharing my screen. Okay, can you see it okay? If not, just shout, all right?
I cannot see it.
Yeah, it's black at the moment. Let me just go. Yeah, this is the first slide. There we go. Okay. My research, as Tina already indicated, is at the intersection of memory and trauma studies and the environmental humanities. From the very start of my career, I've been active in the former field. I've published several books and many essays on how literature bears witness to traumatic events and experiences such as genocide, slavery, and colonialism. More recently, I've developed an interest in the way literature addresses the aesthetic, ethical, and existential challenges posed by a warming planet. I've co-edited a special journal issue on the rise of climate change fiction, and I've been teaching an MA course on the same topic for the last few years. I've recently also guest edited a special journal issue on ecological grief, and my latest research, which I want to talk to you about today, builds on that. The phenomenon I'm interested in exploring is what I call ecological mourning. The experience and anticipation of environmental loss, whether of plant and animal species, ecosystems, landscapes, or an inhabitable planet, cause profound sorrow. That sorrow is being felt more and more acutely by a growing portion of the world's population as we move ever deeper into the Anthropocene. However, as yet, we are somewhat at a loss as to how to adequately navigate the affective terrain of environmental breakdown. Lacking standard protocols and procedures, we do not quite know how to make sense of, channel, or cope with ecological grief. However, literature and art can be seen to serve as a cultural laboratory for articulating and dealing with grief related to environmental loss, a type of grief that remains largely unspoken and unrecognized despite its pervasiveness. The act of naming the often marginalized forms of grief arising from environmental loss is a major step in bringing them to public awareness and granting them social acceptance and legitimacy so that they can be processed more effectively. Coming to terms with ecological grief can reinvigorate practices of environmental advocacy in the face of the daunting ecological challenges confronting global society in the 21st century. In this short presentation, I'll make this all a little more concrete by focusing on the phenomenon of glacier funerals, which has helped ecological mourning go mainstream in recent years, or at least it has opened up a public conversation about it. I will use the story of the funeral for a dead Icelandic glacier, Jökull, to delineate some distinctive features of ecological mourning that set it apart from dominant conceptualizations of mourning, which are typically centered around the loss of a loved one. Another reason why this story drew my attention, besides the fact that many aspects of ecological mourning converge in it, is that it points to the key role of aesthetic mediation in the process of coming to terms with ecological grief. I will conclude my talk by saying a few words about this. The official demise of Jökull, the glacier atop Iceland's OK, or Ok volcano, I should say, was marked with a memorial ceremony and the installation of a memorial plaque warning of the impact of climate change at the site of the former glacier in August 2019. Attended by about 100 scientists, activists, dignitaries, farmers, politicians, journalists, and children, the event was covered by news outlets around the world, including BBC and the New York Times, and photographs of the plaque even went viral. Evidently striking a chord with many people, the funeral for Jökull, the world's first memorial service for a glacier, was followed by similar ceremonies for other glaciers in Europe, the Americas, and Asia. These funeral rites for vanished glaciers extend our conception of what counts as mournable entities. Conceived by the American anthropologists Dominic Boyer and Simone Howe, the funeral for the Icelandic glacier involved the presentation of an official death certificate by a glaciologist listing excessive heat and humans as the cause of death. The implication obviously was that the glacier had once been alive, an idea reinforced by the documentary about Ecological created by Boyer and Howe together with an Icelandic filmmaker. Not or not okay, as the documentary is called, is narrated in the personified voice of Mountain, a mountain who has been observing humans for a long time and has a few things to say to us, as the accompanying website announces. The idea of a glacier funeral caused a sensation, as non-human entities are traditionally regarded as being outside the realm of the grievable in Western cultures. As Ashley Carcciolo and Karen Landman note in their introduction to Mourning Nature, Hope at the Heart of Ecological Loss and Grief, we tend to associate grief and mourning with human losses, not with more than human ones. The funeral for Ecological undid this conventional separation between entities that can and cannot be mourned, which appears to be taken for granted by most theorists of mourning, from Sigmund Freud to Judith Butler. Moreover, in scaling up, or in calling on us rather, to go beyond approaches to mourning that privilege human bodies, glacier funerals dramatically scale up the magnitude of the kinds of losses to be mourned, both spatially and temporally. They extend grievability to geological features that not only occupy vast territories, but whose demise is the result of long drawn-out processes that transcend the duration of a single human life. Something else that distinguishes ecological mourning from mourning for the loss of a loved one is the fact that grief over environmental loss or environmental decline is often intermingled with feelings of guilt or shame. After all, we are often complicit in environmental loss, if only by virtue of living in the Anthropocene. We mourn not only what we have lost, but also what we have destroyed. The awareness of human responsibility for or implication in environmental loss complicates the grieving process and may partially account for the prevalence of denial and avoidance of the work of ecological mourning. The inscription on the plaque installed at the base of Iceland's Glacier during the funeral ceremony confronts the present-day reader with their responsibility for the environmental loss being commemorated. Entitled A Letter to the Future, the plaque reads, "Ok is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it." Followed by an imprint of Earth's CO2 levels as of August 2019, it's 415 parts per million. The plaque calls on passers-by to acknowledge the disappearance of a major geographical feature while implicating them as part of the human collective responsible for the glacier's death. At the same time, the plaque posits a future unknown observer as the evaluator of our time's efforts to mitigate the environmental crisis. The plaque's subtle shift in tenses asks us to take personal account for present losses resulting from collective human activity on our planet, while demanding that we uphold the promise and possibility of a future in which such an observer can exist to measure our species' success, the only scenario in which a future observer would be guaranteed. This orientation towards the future points to the activist potential of ecological mourning, which is seen as a politically and ethically transformative practice. To quote an opinion essay in the New York Times by the Prime Minister of Iceland, published on the eve of the Glacier funeral, which she attended, "On Sunday, we pay tribute to Uk. At the same time, we join hands to prevent future farewells to all the world's glaciers. The hope, if not the conviction, that pain and sorrow can be mobilized for positive action for the environment is a common thread running through much work on ecological grief, not least the essays gathered in Carcciolo and Landman's collection." It's also worth noting that the inscription on the commemorative plaque erected at Ecologikal's funeral was written by Andri Snær Magnusson, an acclaimed Icelandic writer. Moreover, the funeral ceremony included not only speeches, but also a poetry reading. And I've already mentioned the non-human narrator in the Not Okay documentary. It's through the use of literary language then that the passing of the first of Iceland's named glaciers lost to climate change managed to capture the popular imagination around the world. In fact, Howe and Boyer, who had invited Magnusson to write the inscription, had spoken eloquently of the key role to be played by literature and art in addressing the climate and ecological crisis. It's safe to say that there's no shortage of artistic responses to the loss of ice as one of the most sensitive indicators of climate change and a source of profound ecological grief. A well-known example is the temporary installation Ice Watch by the Danish-Icelandic artist Olafur Eliasson, which consisted of giant blocks of glacial ice extracted from the water surrounding Greenland that were installed and left to melt in public spaces across London. I've got another example, which I'll skip, but let me briefly mention this one, which is another famous instance. That's Elegy for the Arctic, an evocative online video in which the Italian composer Ludovico Einaudi performs a melancholy piece on a grand piano sitting atop an artificial iceberg as an Arctic glacier crumbles into the ocean behind him. Creative works such as these perform an important service in opening up a space in which the disenfranchised kinds of grief associated with environmental loss can be acknowledged, expressed, and channeled in constructive ways. I'll leave it there. I hope this has given you an idea, at least, of where my research is going. And if you'd like to discuss it further with me, then don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stef. That's really impressive. And I think it links in well with my talk. Just a second, I have to share it here. Can you see it? Sorry. Can you see the slide?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so my talk is called Ecologies of Scale, How to Address the Limits of Human Perception. And my research sits in NUI Galway's collaborative project, Post-Human Futures, Ecology, Economy, Community, that I have founded with colleagues from Irish Studies and Sociology. I think Nessa Cronin is here today in the audience also. And we also have network links with colleagues at Trinity College Dublin, Ghent University, and UCD. Framing environmental objects poses extreme challenges with regard to scale. For example, in the case of large objects such as climate change, its unboundedness, incalculability, and unthinkability, but also at microscopic level in the case of thinking the human as a constantly changing community of other life forms and artificial extensions. In addition, nanoprocesses are being offered as solutions for large-scale geoengineering of the planet for climate mitigation, such as nanoparticles to reduce the Earth's albedo or in human enhancement discourses. And I've linked here, or I've shown here the three authors that I owe a lot to my project, Donna Haraway, Timothy Morton, and Rosie Predotti. In this context, I engage with the ideological load of popular narratives, such as right-wing cultures of preparation, i.e. providing a historical perspective of why people build shelters, bunkers, and other provisional escape places, religiously motivated discourses of separation or cohabitation with other species, or the effects of hygiene management on forms of habitation. The necessity to include both dimension expansions in our thinking, the large-scale objects of climate change, as well as the microscopic levels of penetration and symbiosis by viruses, bacteria, or nanoparticles, not only destabilizes our experience of distinct spaces, but also of time. In both cases, actions are required that alter the scale in which we are used to operate at institutional, infrastructural, interpersonal, and organizational level. And because those actions are required, framing environmental objects consciously remains necessary, even if this temporarily reduces their level of unboundedness or complexity for the purpose of agency. So Finding workable narratives for individual and communal experiences and to project alternative futures are necessary endeavors if we were to instigate coordinated changes in our behaviors, politics, or economies, which could secure future human habitation on our planet. So my project explores the limits of this we and the usefulness and ethics of such narratives in a post-human, eco-critical setting, but also their necessary flexibility in the context of kinship and constant change. Being fully aware that the most recent post-humanist turn in eco-criticism requires that we rethink the category of the human with very permeable boundaries to multiple species that inhabit it or pass through it, to technologies that extend, change, and reprogram the many ways in which we perceive and organize our encounters with other living or non-living objects, being also fully aware that this greatly affects concepts of subjectivity, agency, identity, and self. There still is a we that is being left with the task to understand the implications of this permeability and unboundedness, that is left with the task to locate itself in the world nevertheless. And on a day-to-day basis, we already do that, and we are very flexible and playful with this. For example, health-conscious eaters now consume their daily share of pre- and probiotics to change their microbiome, the community of bacteria living in their guts, into an environment more in line with the longevity of the biotope that they define as their bodies. The COVID experience had made us painfully aware of how easily we exchange particles when we are merely breathing. But it also has made us painfully aware of the backlash to the complexity of this awareness, the yearning to simplify, to act within or to rebel against clear rules, the anger towards ambiguity, the organizational deadlock of institutions who always act too slowly when they are reactive or lack sufficient societal support when they act preemptively. And this rebellion and aggression seems deeply ingrained. From a socio-historical point of view, the human need for shelter seems unquestionable. For millennia, humans have built dwelling places to shelter themselves from exposure to the threats posed by their environments. But whereas fences and shelters once seemed essential to our survival, in an age of overpopulation and ecological crisis, in which mankind figures as the single biggest threat to the well-being of the ecosphere, it is now the environment which seems to be in need of being sheltered from us. But our faith in the fence seems inexhaustible, and that is the case on both ends of the political spectrum, where, for example, prepper cultures and protectionists aim to shut nature out and are devoid of any empathy for fellow humans arriving at our borders. Many eco-activists try to shut nature in nature reserves and conservation zones, trying to exempt species and habitats from destruction. Both approaches suffer from what Timothy Morton describes as eco-pathological consequences of how we came to define nature since Descartes as something that is separate from us, and under which we subsume a variety of living and non-living objects, depending on various ideologies that we are part of. These exemptions, however, are little more than an alibi for ever greater exploitation and eradication of wilderness on the outside of those zones. So in the face of the fact that we cannot save the planet by trying to save ourselves, art and philosophy ask new and provocative questions. Can we acknowledge and approve of our contingencies with and exposures to our environments? Are we really ready to face the open in which we participate, regardless of how and where we live? So on one hand, we have these right-wing cultures of preparation through bunkers, body bags, and armament. And they tend to wish for an acceleration of a future in which the apocalypse is embraced and encouraged by narratives of salvation of the few, so either by a messianic event or an end game in which those survive that are best equipped. And we found multiple echoes of these narratives in COVID herd immunity discourses, where the vulnerable and the old were pretty much treated as sacrificial bodies. On the other hand, we have groups who want to leave these strictly anthropocentric narratives, which depend on a human nature divine behind, in favor of new transhuman models of cohabitation with other species, So Haraway and Anat Singh are important thinkers in that regard. And they call both sides of this divide, human and nature, into question. And for this, we need to popularize speculative literature, art, games that are not centered on the lone, normally white and male survivalist and his in-group. And thankfully, we had a lot of example of such speculative fiction today already in the second talk. Where we cannot abstractly think the complexity of climate change and mass extinction, we already spend big parts of our leisure time in projected futures through reading, through watching, through gaming. So computer games are also an important medium in this regard. And those virtual spaces shape our perception and expectations. It is imagined futures that allow us to break with thinking patterns of the present. Yet these spaces are just as polarized as discussions in social networks, where, for example, a face mask in one group is seen as a signifier of care, of togetherness, of consideration, but in another group as a signifier of weakness, isolation, and oppression. And I would argue that this is at its very core a problem of translation. As neural network computing becomes better and better translating between languages and producing comprehensible text, humans are currently unlearning how to talk to each other when they leave their peer groups. Where vector-based language programming ignores the ideological load of words in favor of frequency and proximity to other words in the cloud, the interpreting disciplines, the humanities, need to come back in and confront an enormous task. Not only do we need to create ways of thinking that encompass species kinship, that are undistancing us from our environments, that unlock futures different from mere apocalyptic and survival narratives, but we also have to remain, or rather become able to translate these respectfully into contexts in which this worldview is not shared. Thank you. So yeah, that was my talk. And I now have the opportunity to hand over to Christel.
Thank you. I will first share my screen. Can you see the presentation? Okay, so first of all, thank you. I'm very happy to be here, and thanks Alexandra and Stef for involving me in this. I'm truly honored to be here and to be able to speak to you. So I would, instead of focusing only on my own research or one research, I would like to give a kind of overview of the rich and diverse research that is being conducted in SPAM. SPAM is the research center of which I'm the director. But I would also like to focus and to stress that my thinking is always what I would like to call a hyphenated thinking. My thinking is always in collaboration with the people I work with in SPAM, but also in collaboration with scientists, with engineers, with artists, and with activists. Because thinking is not an individual thing. It is something that is shared and that is always based on other people's ideas. So I also would like to stress that our research in SPAM is truly interdisciplinary. So it is embedded in broader research structures. And as you can see, there are the two research consortia in the bottom. You have the Human Research Consortium on Human Rights Research, led by Eva Brems. And then the other one is a collaboratorium for Ghent sustainability issues, which is led by Thomas Bloch, which is a city academy. And this also means that within our research, we team up with valorization initiatives, but also with human rights issues and political issues. And this gives an idea that within SPAM, we do not only deal with theater, but also with performance, with dance and media art. So it's the performing arts in its broadest sense. it is truly interdisciplinary, intermedial and cross-cultural. Together with Bram van Oostveld, who is my colleague, we deal with contemporary, but also with historical issues. And the theoretical and the practice-based research is treated on the same level. So Ghent University is an academic institution, but we have a very nice collaboration with Kask School of Art. So we have a lot of practice-based researchers, and I consider their production of knowledge as equal. So I think also we can guess from the talk by Stef that literature and art can produce knowledge that raises awareness in a very particular way, and it is very valuable and can sometimes do that in a way that academics cannot. It's because of their ambiguity. It's because of the fact that art should not give a definite answer to things, but that can give us the worries, that can give the questions, and that can raise questions. Therefore, it's also very valuable to collaborate with art because they have that particular production of knowledge. And for that reason, we are also firmly embedded in the lively performing art scene in Flanders, and we have strategic partnerships with art centers, with performance groups, etc. And this is where our research grows, in this hyphenated thinking. We have several research tracks within SPEM, and one of them is ecologies. And this is also, of course, where climate change comes in. But I would like to say something about ecology first, because if we think of this term in an etymological sense, the term ecology combines the Greek word oikos, meaning house or dwelling place, and logos, meaning reason or study. So the ecological perspective in my research connects environmental thinking with notions of home, with notions of belonging. And this in a way draws on Félix Guattari's book, The Three Ecologies, in which he talks about the ethico-aesthetic ages of an ecosophy. So it's a contraction of ecology and philosophy that connects the environmental with the reflection on the psychic production of subjectivity, with the production also of social relations. So as such, gender and post-colonial perspectives are an inherent part of the ecological research that is firmly embedded in the field of performance philosophy. And also my own research meets with current paradigm shifts in ecological thinking and explores new modes of activism to tackle the complexity of current ecological crises, such as climate change. So drawing on Bruno Latour, for example, and his notion of political ecology, this is something very important in our research. So Bruno Latour, he moves beyond the practice of ecology movements that are still burdened by the ideal image of nature. And I think, yes, I agree, because I think we should not move towards one ideal in the past, rather we can imagine differential futures. And I think our life is a continuous co-creation of our current multiple situatedness in catastrophe. Another important source there is Donna Haraway and her notion of art, science, activist worldings. And this is where the hyphenated thinking also comes up. So rather than seeing art as a kind of example that illustrates a theoretical idea, I consider art as an equal partner. And it's really in the hyphens that the thinking is being conducted. So it's not art being an auxiliary or something that supports science. It's not an activist that is part of a thinking. No, it's really in the hyphens that the thinking happens. And my research and education projects, they consider art practices as activating awareness and change, but also generating new modes of activism as an important element. Now, let me give some examples to make this more concrete. For example, in ecologies, if we talk about these notions of home, these notions of belonging, it also has to do with trauma care. We do not think that we can cure things, but at least we can care about issues such as ecological grief, the thing that Stef, my colleague, has been talking about as well. We also talk about migration because things as climate change, they move people, not only in an emotional way, but also in a way that they have to leave their space where they belonged because of climate change. And then we also can talk about equal performances, where it's not only about giving critique, but also producing knowledge that has to do with other modes of knowledge production. I see that I'm running out of time now, so I'm just moving towards the last slide here. These were examples where we could do this, but if you would like to read more about this, we have a publication that is edited by me and two dear colleagues of mine on performance and posthumanism, and in which we have this hyphenated thinking put in a book, and in which we stage prototypes of these composite bodies. And these composite bodies can be interpreted in many ways. It can be partly activist, it can be partly scientist, but also very artful, I hope. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christel, and sorry for disrupting the end of your talk. I just wanted to have a few minutes at least at the end where perhaps the audience can switch on their cameras too, and where we could perhaps answer one or two questions before we then move over to the networking space that should be typed into the chat function, the link.
I'm not sure the audience can turn on the cameras.
Or is it a webinar setting? Okay. But anyway, I think they can unmute their microphones if they want to ask a question. Oh, no, they can't. Okay, so in this case, I would like to thank all the speakers for their fantastic timekeeping, for their very inspiring talks. And I'm really looking forward to move over to the networking space. And I hope we can meet our audience there and can see how we can collaborate. Thank you very much.
So Tina, we now move to another room to...
Okay.
Sorry, are we to shut this session down or?